Most of us were raised on the legend of the few, those brave boys and Spitfires who held the line by the skin of their teeth. It's a stirring story, but it's only half the truth. History suggests that while the RAF was fighting for its life, the German Luftwaffe was busy committing the greatest logistical suicide in military history. We've been told the Battle of Britain was a close-run thing, but when you look at the cold data of fuel ranges and the invisible trap laid by Dowding, you realize the German Eagle didn't just stumble, it was led into a slaughterhouse by its own leadership. Today, we're looking past the propaganda to see how Hitler's personal hubris actually broke the back of the Luftwaffe before the invasion even began. Think back to the early summer of 1940. Most of us grew up hearing the stories of the few who saved the many, but we rarely talk about the sheer, blinding arrogance that sat across the English Channel. At that moment, Adolf Hitler didn't just think he could win, he felt he had already won. To the German High Command, the Royal Air Force wasn't a wall, it was a nuisance. They looked at the map of a conquered Europe, Poland, Norway, and the sudden, shocking fall of France, and saw a pattern of invincibility. They believed they had perfected a new kind of war, and that Britain, with its aging traditions and weekend pilots, was merely a paper tiger waiting for the final gust of wind to knock it over. History reveals that this dismissal wasn't just bluster, it was a systemic intelligence failure. Hitler's chief military advisor, General Alfred Jodl, initially viewed the RAF not as a peer competitor, but as a hurdle to a political solution. In fact, until July 1940, Hitler was so confident Britain would simply sue for peace that he dithered on signing Directive No. 16 for the invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. When the Luftwaffe finally did turn its eyes toward the UK, they relied on reports from Colonel Josef Schmid, the head of Luftwaffe intelligence, which were laughably inaccurate. Schmid told Goering that the RAF had only about 200 frontline fighters. In reality, Air Chief Marshal Dowding had over 600. Even more egregious, the Germans saw the tall, spindly towers of the British chain-home radar stations and essentially shrugged. They understood the technology. Germany had pioneered its own radar, but they failed to grasp the Dowding system, a revolutionary command and control network that linked those eyes to a central nervous system of telephone lines and sector stations. The Luftwaffe was a tactical air force designed to work like a flying hammer for the army. They expected the Battle of Britain to be a 4-day blitzkrieg in the sky. But the RAF was the only force in the world specifically built for a strategic defensive campaign. While Goering was showing off his medals and laughing about weekend flyers, the British were producing nearly 500 fighters a month, twice the German production rate. Hitler dismissed the RAF as a broken remnant of Dunkirk, but he was actually looking at a specialized industrial-scale machine designed for exactly one purpose: the defense of the home skies. But why was the German leadership so convinced that the RAF would crumble in a matter of days? To understand that, we have to look back at the Spanish Mirage and the lessons the Luftwaffe learned, and more importantly, the lessons they ignored during the dry runs of the late 1930s. If you want to understand how a military genius loses his way, you have to look at the danger of an easy victory. For the men in the German High Command, men who had seen the stalemate of the Great War trenches, the late 1930s felt like they had discovered a cheat code for history. They looked at their success in the Spanish Civil War not as a limited experiment, but as the ultimate blueprint for all future conflict. We often hear about the Condor Legion as a terrifying force, and it was. But for the Luftwaffe, Spain was a seductive trap. It taught them that air power was a support tool for the tank, a flying artillery that worked best when the enemy was disorganized and the skies were uncontested. They walked away from Spain believing that a modern air war could be won in an afternoon by simply scaring the opponent into submission. This was the Spanish Mirage, the belief that because they could crush a divided, ill-equipped Spanish Republic, they could dismantle the British Empire with the same casual ease. The data coming out of Spain gave the German Luftwaffe a false sense of technological superiority that would haunt them over the English Channel. During the conflict, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Heinkel He-111 ran circles around older biplanes. German pilots like the legendary Adolf Galland developed the Rote and Schwarm Finger 4 formations, tactics that were undeniably superior to the rigid V formations the RAF was still using in 1939. Because these tactics worked so flawlessly against the disorganized resistance in Spain and Poland, Hermann Göring and his inner circle reached a fatal conclusion. They believed the individual superiority of the German pilot and the speed of their aircraft were the only variables that mattered. But here is where the arrogance turned into a blind spot. In Spain, the Luftwaffe operated from airfields that were often just a few miles from the front lines. They never had to worry about loiter time or fuel reserves. Because they were fighting a tactical war, they neglected the development of a heavy, four-engine strategic bomber, the kind of Ural bomber that General Walther Wever had championed before his untimely death in 1936. When Wever died, the strategic vision of the Luftwaffe died with him. His successor, Ernst Udet, was a Great War ace who loved dive bombing. He insisted that nearly every German plane, even the heavy ones, be capable of diving to increase accuracy. This was a brilliant move for supporting a panzer division in Poland, but it was a disaster for a long-range air campaign. It meant the Luftwaffe entered the Battle of Britain with medium bombers like the Dornier Do-107 and the Heinkel He-111, which lacked the bomb load to truly level an industrial city and the defensive armament to survive without a constant escort. Furthermore, the Spanish Mirage convinced Göring that the sheer psychological terror of the Stuka siren, the Jericho trumpet, would break British resolve. They had seen it in Guernica and Warsaw. But the British weren't the Spanish Republicans. They were a unified island nation with a professionalized civil defense and an air force that was being built specifically to counter high-altitude raids. The Germans were bringing a knife to a gunfight, but because that knife had worked so well in the past, they refused to believe the gun existed. They ignored the fact that in Spain, they never had to fly more than 50 miles to find their targets. In the upcoming battle, their pilots would be flying at the absolute limit of their fuel tanks with no margin for error. Therefore, when the German Eagle finally turned its gaze toward the white cliffs of Dover, it wasn't just facing a new enemy. It was facing a geographic reality it was never designed to handle. The Luftwaffe was built to cross borders on land, but it was about to find out that the English Channel wasn't just a body of water, it was a logistical graveyard. For any man who has ever worked with machinery or managed a complex project, you know that the plan is only as good as the fuel in the tank and the spare parts in the shed. In the summer of 1940, the German High Command made a mistake that any veteran logistics officer would find unforgivable. They treated the English Channel as if it were just a slightly wider version of the Rhine River. In Poland and France, the Luftwaffe had moved in lockstep with the panzers. As the tanks rolled forward, the ground crews followed, setting up makeshift airfields in the wake of the advance. It was a short-leash strategy that worked brilliantly on a continuous landmass. But the moment the German army hit the coast at Calais, that leash snapped. The channel wasn't just 20 miles of water, it was a psychological and mechanical barrier that turned the Luftwaffe's greatest strengths into glaring liabilities. They were about to learn that fighting over an ocean is a different breed of war, one where there is no emergency landing in a hayfield. The most damning piece of data in this logistical blunder centers on the Messerschmitt Bf-109, a masterpiece of engineering, but one with a short heart. Because it was designed for short-range tactical support, its internal fuel capacity was roughly 400 liters. To an American driver of that era, that might sound like a lot, but in a high-performance Daimler-Benz engine, it provided a total flight time of barely 90 minutes. Once you factor in the flight from the French interior to the English coast, the climb to combat altitude, and the fuel-heavy maneuvers of a dogfight, a German pilot often had only 10 to 20 minutes of actual fighting time over London before his fuel light began to flicker. If he stayed for 21 minutes, he was likely going to end up in the drink. In contrast, the British Spitfires and Hurricanes were taking off from airfields in their own backyards. They could land, refuel, rearm, and be back in the air while the German pilot was still halfway across the channel, sweating over his fuel gauge. Furthermore, the Germans failed to prepare for the attrition of the ocean. In France, a damaged German plane could often belly land and be repaired by a mobile crew within 48 hours, but over the channel, a damaged plane was a lost plane. If a single bullet hit a radiator or an oil line, that aircraft, and more importantly, its highly trained pilot, was swallowed by the sea. History shows us that the Luftwaffe lost hundreds of irreplaceable aircrews not to British bullets, but to the cold reality of the water. While the British were recovering their pilots who bailed out over Kent and Sussex and putting them back in new planes by dinner time, the German pilot who bailed out was either dead or in a prisoner of war camp. The continental blunder was thinking they could win a war of attrition when their revolving door of replacement pilots was essentially locked shut by the geography of the channel itself. They had no effective air-sea rescue service at the start of the battle, whereas the British were using everything from specialized launches to local fishing boats to pull their boys home. But logistical failure was only half the story. While the Luftwaffe was struggling just to stay in the air, they were flying into an invisible trap. They couldn't understand why, no matter where they crossed the coast, the RAF was already there, waiting for them in the sun. Therefore, the battle wasn't being decided by engines and fuel alone, but by a silent electronic pulse that the Germans simply didn't respect. Have you ever played a game where your opponent seemed to know your every move before you even made it? It's a maddening, helpless feeling. In the late summer of 1940, that is exactly what was happening to the Luftwaffe. The German pilots were world-class, their machines were engineering marvels, and their numbers were overwhelming. By all the laws of traditional warfare, they should have swept the RAF from the sky in a week. But they found themselves flying into a ghost in the machine. They would cross the coast at 20,000 feet, hidden by clouds or the glare of the morning sun, only to find a squadron of Hurricanes sitting right in their path, perfectly positioned with the altitude advantage. It felt like the British had 1,000 eyes, and as it turns out, they did. While Hitler was focused on the will to power, a quiet, methodical man named Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding was perfecting the world's first integrated defense network. He knew that the clock was ticking and that the only way to beat a superior force was to stop guessing where they were and start knowing where they were. The secret to this invisible shield wasn't just the radar itself, but how the information flowed. The Germans actually had radar technology, the Freya system, that was, in some ways, more sophisticated than the British version. But there was a fundamental difference in philosophy. The Germans used radar as a local tool for anti-aircraft guns. Dowding, however, used it as the eyes of a massive singular organism. Across the eastern and southern coasts of England stood the chain home stations. To a German pilot looking down, these looked nothing more than harmless, spindly radio masts. In reality, they were flooding the channel with radio waves. The moment a German formation took off from France, these stations picked them up. But here is the reward, the true stroke of genius. The information didn't go to the pilots, it went to a filter room deep underground at Bentley Pryor. In this room, young women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or WAF, used long wooden rakes to move markers across a giant map table. They were processing raw data into a real-time picture of the battle. They calculated the enemy's speed, height, and bearing. This was the Dowding system. Within 4 minutes of a German plane leaving French soil, a British sector commander had all the data he needed to scramble exactly the right number of fighters. This allowed the RAF to do something the Luftwaffe thought was impossible. They stayed on the ground until the last possible second. The Germans assumed the RAF was down to its last 50 Spitfires because they rarely saw more than a dozen at a time. What they didn't realize was that Dowding wasn't wasting a single drop of fuel or a single pilot's energy on patrols. He was using his invisible shield to intercept with surgical precision. The Germans were fighting a blind, bludgeoning war of exhaustion. The British were fighting a scientific war of efficiency.
History shows us that during the height of the battle, the RAF was achieving an interception rate of nearly 80%. In the history of aerial warfare, that number is staggering. It meant that for every 5 missions the Luftwaffe flew, they were met by a wall of lead at least 4 times. The clock was ticking against the Germans because every hour they spent in the air, the Dowding system was learning their patterns, refining its math, and tightening the noose.
Even more frustrating for the German High Command was their own refusal to acknowledge the shield. General Wolfgang Martini, the Luftwaffe's signals chief, suspected the radar towers were important, but Göring dismissed them. "The English," Göring famously remarked, "don't have the stomach for a scientific war." It was perhaps the most expensive ego trip in military history. By the time the Luftwaffe realized that those radio masts were the heart of the British defense, it was already too late. The few had been given the gift of sight, and the many were flying blindly into a trap they couldn't see. Even with this technological miracle, the RAF was bleeding. They were losing pilots faster than they could train them, and their airfields were being turned into moonscapes of craters and fire. The invisible shield was holding, but the wall behind it was cracking. Then, at the very moment the British were at their breaking point, Hitler made a decision so fundamentally flawed that it changed the course of the 20th century. In any great struggle, there is a moment where the victor isn't the one who plays perfectly, but the one who survives long enough for the opponent to lose his nerve. By late August 1940, the Royal Air Force was not winning, it was dying. If you had been standing on the tarmac at an airfield like Biggin Hill or Manston, you wouldn't have seen a glorious defense. You would have seen exhausted mechanics working on charred airframes and pilots falling asleep in their cockpits from sheer mental collapse. The Dowding system was magnificent, but it couldn't repair a bombed-out runway or replace a pilot who had been flying 6 sorties a day for a month. The Luftwaffe had finally found the RAF's jugular, the sector stations. By focusing their bombers on the ground infrastructure of fighter command, the Germans were inches away from a total strategic collapse of the British defense. And then, in a moment of pure emotional vanity, the German leadership blinked. They turned their eyes away from the throat of the RAF and looked toward the lights of London. This shift, known to history as the switch to the Blitz, was sparked by a singular, almost accidental event. On the night of August 24th, a few lost Luftwaffe bombers aiming for oil tanks at Thameshaven accidentally dropped their payloads on civilian London. In retaliation, Churchill ordered a modest, largely symbolic raid on Berlin. To the modern ear, a few bombs on a city might seem like standard fare for war, but to Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring, it was an intolerable insult to their Nordic dignity. Up until this point, the German strategy, Adlertag or Eagle Day, had been working. Between August 24th and September 6th, the RAF lost 295 fighters and had another 171 badly damaged. More critically, 103 pilots were killed or missing. These were losses the British could not sustain. Air Vice Admiral Keith Park, the man in charge of defending London's doorstep, later admitted that his sector stations were on the verge of being put out of action. But on September 7th, Göring made the most disastrous tactical pivot of the war. Believing the RAF was already finished, he ordered a massive fleet of nearly 1,000 aircraft to bypass the fighter airfields and strike the city of London directly. He thought this would force the last few British fighters into one final decisive battle where they could be swatted down. He was wrong. By switching to London, the Luftwaffe inadvertently gave the RAF's sector stations a breathing space. For the first time in weeks, the British ground crews could fill in the craters, fix the telephone lines, and let their pilots sleep. The reward for the British was time, the most precious commodity in war. While London burned, the RAF's nerves were being rebuilt. Even more significant was the change in altitude and distance. Bombing London meant the German bombers had to fly deeper into British territory, staying longer in the kill zone of the Dowding system.
The short-range Bf-109s, which we discussed earlier, now had virtually zero time to protect their bombers. They would arrive over London, engage in one 3-minute dogfight, and have to turn for home, leaving the slow, vulnerable Heinekels and Dorniers to be torn apart by arrested and replenished RAF. On September 15th, now celebrated as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe launched another massive wave against London. They expected a ghost air force. Instead, they were met by over 300 fighters in a coordinated swarm. The Germans lost 60 aircraft in a single afternoon. It was the moment the Luftwaffe realized they hadn't broken the RAF, they had accidentally saved it. Hitler, seeing the mounting losses and the failure to achieve air superiority, indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion just 2 days later. Hubris had dictated a change of targets, and in doing so, it had forfeited the only chance Germany had to knock Britain out of the war. We must ask ourselves, how did the British pilots, who were many of them essentially teenagers with barely 10 hours of combat training, manage to hold their nerve during those dark weeks when the outcome was in doubt? Therefore, the victory wasn't just a matter of radar and mistakes, it was an endurance test that pushed the human spirit to its absolute limit. If you look back at the social hierarchy of 1940, it's easy to see why the German High Command felt a sense of natural superiority. The Luftwaffe pilots were the poster boys of the Third Reich, highly disciplined, rigorously trained, and battle-hardened from the campaigns in Poland and France. They viewed the British counterparts as gentlemen amateurs. In the eyes of the German Oberkommando, the RAF was a collection of weekend pilots, young men from wealthy families or boys from the suburbs who spent their Saturdays playing cricket rather than drilling for war. This underestimation of the British character and the specific quality of their training was perhaps the greatest psychological blunder of the entire campaign. The Germans believed that a professional soldier would always beat a motivated citizen, but they failed to realize that when you fight for your own home, amateur status becomes a source of unpredictable, relentless strength. The reality on the ground and in the air was far more complex than the German propaganda suggested. While it's true that many RAF pilots came from the volunteer reserve, their training was built on a foundation of individual initiative that the rigid German structure lacked. In the Luftwaffe, the leader principle meant that pilots often waited for orders from above. In the RAF, once the wheels left the grass, the fight belonged to the pilot. One of the most telling statistics from this period is the kill-to-loss ratio. Despite the Germans having more experienced aces, some with 20 or 30 kills from Spain, the average British pilot was proving to be incredibly resilient. Why? Because the British had a secret weapon in their training, the auxiliary air force. These were the men the Germans mocked, the weekend flyers. But these men were often engineers, lawyers, and mechanics in their civilian lives. They brought a level of maturity and technical understanding to the cockpit that a 20-year-old German recruit simply didn't possess. Furthermore, the British pilot was fighting over his own soil. This provided a psychological reward that cannot be overstated. If a British pilot was shot down and survived, he was often back in a new aircraft within hours. There are records of pilots bailing out of a burning hurricane in the morning, taking a taxi back to their airfield, and being back in a dogfight by the afternoon. Conversely, the German pilots were under immense combat fatigue. Because the Luftwaffe was short on replacements, their pilots were forced to fly until they were killed or captured. There was no rotation home. By September 1940, German intelligence was noting a sharp decline in the aggressiveness of their air crews. They were suffering from what they called Kanalkrankheit, channel sickness. They were exhausted, flying in machines they knew were at the limit of their range against an enemy that seemed to get stronger every time they were hit. The weekend pilots didn't just outlast the Reich, they outproduced them in spirit. For every German pilot who flew because he was told to, a British pilot flew because he had to. By the time the Luftwaffe realized that these amateurs had become the most lethal fighter force in the world, the German elite had been gutted. The Luftwaffe lost over 2,600 aircrew members during the battle, men who could not be easily replaced.
The Tiger had been clawed to death by the very paper it had dismissed. The end of the battle didn't just mean the end of the bombing raids, it meant the permanent shattering of the myth of German invincibility. Therefore, the failure of the Luftwaffe over the Gardens of Kent wasn't just a lost battle, it was the first crack in the foundation of the Thousand-Year Reich, leaving a legacy that we still feel the weight of today. As we look back through the fog of 8 decades, it is easy to view the Battle of Britain as an inevitability, a scripted victory where the good guys were always destined to win. But for those of us who grew up in the shadow of that generation, or for those who have spent a lifetime studying the cold mechanics of history, we know the truth is far more chilling. The margin between the world we live in today and a dark continental tyranny was a razor's edge. If a few more bombs had hit the radar towers, or if Hitler hadn't let his ego dictate the bombing of London, the echoes of Aldertag would have sounded very different. We must confront the uncomfortable reality that the Luftwaffe didn't just lose, they threw away a winning hand because they failed to respect the fundamental principles of strategy, logistics, and the human spirit. The legacy of this failure changed the very DNA of the Second World War. Historians often point to the invasion of Russia or the attack on Pearl Harbor as the beginning of the end for the Axis, but the foundation of those failures was laid in the summer of 1940. Because Hitler could not break the RAF, he was forced to leave a live enemy at his back. This meant that for the rest of the war, Germany was trapped in the very nightmare they had tried to avoid, a two-front war of attrition. It was the creation of a permanent, unsinkable aircraft carrier for the Allied cause. Without a free Britain, there is no Operation Overlord, there is no D-Day, there is no liberation of Western Europe. Every American soldier who stepped onto the beaches of Normandy in 1944 owed his life to a 19-year-old RAF pilot who held the line 4 years earlier. Furthermore, the defeat of the Luftwaffe shattered the political prestige of Hermann Göring and the invincibility of the Nazi war machine. For the first time, the world saw that the Blitzkrieg could be stopped. It gave hope to the resistance movements in occupied France and Poland, and it convinced the United States, specifically President Roosevelt, that Britain was a good bet for Lend-Lease aid. The data shows that after September 1940, American support for Britain skyrocketed because the weekend pilots had proven they could take the Reich's best punch and stay standing. We also see the legacy of this battle in the technology we use today. The Dowding system was the direct ancestor of modern air traffic control and integrated missile defense. The desperate need for better engines led to the perfection of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, an engine so superior it eventually powered the American P-51 Mustang, which would go on to win the daylight skies over Germany. Ultimately, the Battle of Britain reminds us that authority without humility is a recipe for disaster. The Luftwaffe arrived with the most decorated pilots and the most feared reputation in the world, but they were defeated by a man with a map and a group of young men who simply refused to believe they were beaten. As Churchill famously said, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. But, as we have seen, it wasn't just the few in the cockpits, it was the thousands of women at the radar consoles, the mechanics in the mud, and the strategic patience of a command that understood science better than the master race did. The Eagle fell because it assumed its shadow was enough to conquer the world. It forgot that a shadow has no weight, and a determined defender, standing on his own soil, is the heaviest object in history. We honor that victory not just because of the planes, but because it proves that even in the darkest hour, logic, preparation, and quiet courage can dismantle the loudest of tyrannies. History, as we've seen today, isn't just a collection of dates, it's a series of choices made by men under immense pressure. If you value this kind of deep dive into the mechanics of the past, I'd be honored to have you join our growing community. We don't just skim the surface here, we look for the why behind the what. If you haven't yet, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps ensure we can keep producing these long-form documentaries for an audience that respects the details. And I'd like to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the RAF could have held out if Hitler hadn't switched targets to London, or was the Luftwaffe's failure inevitable from the moment they crossed the Channel? I look forward to reading your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next chapter of our history.